I'm Patrick Simmons.
And I'm Mike Little.
And this is All Downhill. This is our second take of attempting to say something about, I guess not just Paris, I think the refugee crisis as a whole.
Yeah, I think we decided to re-record this simply because we were, I think, a little bit too focused last time.
For Thursday, November 19th, this is All Downhill. This episode, the Syrian refugee crisis.
I can't tell what's worse. The hit the magic button on Facebook and watch your profile picture suddenly get to be even dumber than when it turned rainbow colors. Now it will be the French flag. And I'm not saying the problem with showing solidarity with France. That's just a really stupid way to do it. Look, I changed my profile
I never
picture.
got that.
I don't know if that's dumber, though, or the people who are putting different countries' flags over their profile picture to, protest it. I put the Syrian flag on my profile picture to show where the, solidarity for the real victims. And it's okay, I get it, but that's not any less dumb than the French one.
I was actually just out of curiosity to see if anybody had a Lebanese flag gradient anywhere. No one does. I've seen the Syrian flag. I've seen Israeli flags. I've seen the French flags. I even saw a Turkish flag, but no Lebanese flag either. Because, by the way, they were also bombed the shit out of by ISIS the day before Paris, but no one talks about it, which,
I think that's a good place to start. So Vox.com, you sent this article to me, but Vox basically claims, so now everybody's complaining that the media didn't report heavily enough on the bombing the day before the Paris bombing, on this enormous bombing in Beirut.
Yeah, exactly. Beirut, Lebanon, which is, I'm going to throw a conspiracy theory out here. Beirut, the bombings happened in Paris the other day.
Yeah.
Beirut is frequently referred to as the Paris of the Middle East. And New York, which was this center of 9/11, has the Statue of Liberty, which was made in Paris, France.
So you want to throw out the conspiracy theory that this is all against the French?
Yes,
that's rough. But
that's it. I'm just throwing that out there. Let our listeners decide. But anyway, no. So basically, what he's saying is all the major news media articles and outlets posted this. They covered it sufficiently, and no one paid attention to it. And then 2 days later, everyone's bitching because the media didn't report it.
So it's people are saying the media didn't cover it, and Vox is saying yes, we did, and people didn't pay attention.
Yeah, because they don't care, because they don't give, they don't give, what's the line from the song? They don't give equal...
worth to tragedies occurring in English-speaking countries as they do to non-English-speaking
Exactly,
countries.
yeah. Thanks, Grubius Pip.
So you have the better opening to sort of broadening that up, because, as you said earlier, you were listening to NPR all day the day the
yeah, so normally when I'm at work, I have a desk job, so I can listen to my MP3 player, which I normally do. I listen to podcasts, music. Occasionally I turn on, internet radio every once in a while. I forgot my MP3 player, so I had no podcasts, no internet radio. So I was listening to NPR all day on, what was that, the 12th? Because Paris bombings happened on the 13th.
So that would be the 12th.
So that'd be the 12th. And there was not a single mention on NPR, and I was listening all day. Now, I may have missed a little bit at lunch, because I didn't listen at lunch. However, they run news every, probably top of the hour kind of thing. They run news blurbs, I believe.
Yeah, that sounds about
They run
right.
news blurbs at the top of the hour. Not a single one was about Beirut. I didn't know about it at all. I had no clue. And the next morning, before the Paris bombings, I was listening to it in my car on the way to work. Nothing about Beirut whatsoever, even the day of.
And you would think that it would be, before anybody, tries to pull out the, less people died in Beirut, the death toll, at least in the New York Times report on it, says the Lebanese Health Ministry puts the death toll at 43 dead people and over 200 wounded. Yeah, not as many dead as Paris, but that's a huge-ass number of people still.
Yeah, it was a huge number,
wounded,
yeah.
Isn't that a bigger number than Paris?
I think it actually is, when you count wounded, yeah. Casualties.
Yeah, sure.
But no, so I was listening to NPR all day, and then today I hear, at the top of every hour, on the little, news blurb that they do,
Sure.
I heard, and people are complaining about Beirut, that we didn't cover it. Well, NPR did cover it. And so I'm thinking, no, you fucking didn't. So I looked on there, I know that I didn't hear it, so I looked on their website, and here it is, an article. It's just a small little couple paragraph article, nothing huge, and it's gone the next day. I didn't even see it. It was just totally gone. And I didn't know about the Beirut bombings. I normally check Al Jazeera just about every day or every other day. That happened to be a day I didn't check it. So I didn't know, because I know Al Jazeera would post something like that. that. And when I went back, I looked, I saw they did post something. But it just kind of goes, I think that the news media is really just sort of expecting us to not care about it because that's the sort of place where that sort of thing is known to happen a lot. But Beirut, and I did a little bit of research into this, is they don't really have a lot of terrorist attacks happening in Beirut. However, if you look at the Vox article, they actually have more Syrian refugees there than in France. I think currently France has, what's the number? It's 1.1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and then about 600,000 in France, or something like that, or somewhere around those numbers. So it's super disproportionate, especially since Lebanon is such a small country. So it's kind of surprising that it hasn't happened yet, that something that big hasn't happened in Lebanon yet, especially since Hezbollah is actually fighting ISIS, and they're so close. The proximity is so close. So that shows you the import that ISIS has really put on France.
So on the 12th, on the New York Times' website, looking through the captures over the course of the day, I can't find an article on Beirut on their homepage.
See, and that's the thing.
I mean, they have an article on Beirut. Vox links to it. It's definitely, there is an article on ISIS claiming
it's fairly
responsibility
extensive
for it. And it's a fairly extensive article, but I can't find any evidence that it was, in fact, on their main page.
And yeah, so I think that really kind of speaks to, I think Vox is just kind of saying, look, it's really just you dumb fucks who are too busy on your smartphones and wanting to hear what you want to hear and reading what you want to read instead of paying attention to the news. Clearly, and I'm a person who generally tries to stay on top of the news. I didn't do it like really aggressively that day, but I was listening to NPR all day. I would have thought I would have heard something.
You would definitely think. And it mentions, so here's another mention. The New York Times mentions on their site that the Beirut article did appear in print on the 13th, so the day of the Paris bombings.
But all of those people read it?
Well, for one thing, I think it's fair to say that anything that appeared in print on the day of the Paris bombings is likely to have been missed.
Yeah, no.
You're not reading the newspaper when you can turn on the TV and see something being blown up.
Although, to be fair, the Paris stuff happened in the afternoon for us.
In the afternoon. Well, the other thing is the New York Times article on Beirut was on page A6, according to the New York Times.
Page A6.
A6.
Yeah.
So we're not talking this is front page news. Now, in all fairness, usually news that happens in other countries isn't. But I bet you front page news included things like some kind of bitching about Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton.
Oh, I'm sure that they did. And actually,
I say this without picking up a copy and making sure, obviously, but
I actually heard more bitching about Donald Trump and the quote-unquote Republican problem with immigration and how they're all picking it up because of the Paris thing and the whole, these people are Syrian migrants that pulled off this attack sort of thing. I've been hearing more about that today than I have about Paris and Beirut combined.
Right.
All day.
That's a hard subject, and that's, I think, the big problem with the refugee crisis, is that's where we get into, there is, I think, justification for both sides of this argument.
Yeah.
On one hand, letting refugees in, I'll be fair here, letting refugees in can pose a potential security threat. I'm not going to deny that. I'm not saying don't let any refugees in. Don't misconstrue what I'm doing here. But there's a clear potential security threat, only in the sense of if you are letting large numbers of people in. I'm not saying the refugees are terrorists. I'm saying a terrorist could easily slip in with them. And, people are saying that's why we need some kind of good background check system. And other people are saying, well, that's why you can't let any refugees because there is no good background check system. I think both of those are actually fairly true. I think I don't think you need a good background check system only because it is in fact impossible. There is no way to check every refugee. For that matter, it's damn near impossible to check even a refugee and determine if they're a terrorist.
Exactly. Well, so that's why somebody said, I think, you just don't let in the males of combat age of some sort, something like that.
I have an issue with that too. I have
which
two
is kind
issues
of
with that. Because
bizarre.
One issue with that I think is missed out on. There's child bombers. There can be women-side suicide bombers, and I know there have been. That isn't a foolproof plan. You're then getting into the territory of, so do you split up families? And once you split them up, what do the men do? Is it, yes, you can come in, ma'am, and your kids can come in, and while you're floundering around bazillions of miles away from your home country, we're gonna, ship your husband back?
Yeah, and see, I mean, I didn't agree with it either, but I mean, that's something that has been thrown around.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of bizarre.
And people also do this whole, the refugees clearly don't need to get in because they have smartphones or whatever, so clearly they're wealthy and stuff, and which I think at least we're finally starting to see the death of that argument when the situation has escalated to the point of, I think your average intelligent person does realize that it doesn't matter one darn bit if they have a smartphone. They're not fleeing being broke. They're fleeing bombings.
Yeah, I
no
mean,
amount of having a smartphone protects you against. I mean, I suppose we might, is there an app for that? Is there an app that tells you if a bomb's landing on your head?
I don't think so.
Because I'm not seeing smartphones helping you with that.
See, wait, no, Patrick, that's where we need to corner the market. We should release an app that tells you when people are gonna bomb your ass.
Them having smartphones doesn't mean they're rich and don't need help. And
Yeah.
even if they do come over with a bunch of money, it's still the issue whether we're taking care of them or letting them in at all. But I do think we're finally starting to see the death of they're too rich to need our help argument, and we're getting to there's more to this than that. This is getting away from being bombed. This is not an economic migration.
Yeah.
But I'm not thinking to the large degree, it's not like these people want to leave their homes.
Well, no, and would you, if you grew up in this place, you grew up here and someone just started bombing the shit out of it, which you did grow up here, would you want to, come back at some point? Would you want to leave?
No, I think...
No,
I'm
you
sure,
would have to leave
I'm sure
if
there's
people were
who
bombing.
live places where they want out. I'm sure there's people who live in Syria and actually don't want to live there and are refugees. There are people who are born in New York City or Alaska or anywhere on Earth, and they're like, man, I'd really like to live anywhere but here. If your place starts to get bombed and you leave, you're not leaving because of that. You're leaving because of the bombing.
Yeah, basically.
So...
but that still leaves you with the whole problem of, well, what do we do with these people?
Who do we let in?
Yeah, who do we let in? And I think it's almost even less straightforward than the whole illegal immigration thing that everyone's been harping on. Mexican or South American illegal immigrants.
Well, because also refugees they're not like illegal immigrants. There's pretty significant usually
ramifications
processes to being a refugee. It's not like you show up as a refugee and you sneak in and take our gerbs. If you come in as a refugee, usually you've come in through a refugee program. It's why they talk about, the president talks about admitting X number of refugees. They don't talk about admitting illegal immigrants. They may talk about offering amnesty or citizenship to them, but you never hear, well, let's admit 10,000 illegal immigrants. Refugees come in through a very different system.
Yeah, no, it's a whole different thing. And I think that's kind of, and again, that was what I heard a lot of all day today, where they were just equating that argument to the refugee argument. And I think it's a very unfair comparison.
Yeah, it's not.
Because I think there's more validity to saying, look, we need to keep some of these people out, especially considering the climate, versus we just need to build a wall and deport all Mexicans because they're Turking our gerbs.
Right, exactly.
It's a much more sensitive situation. And like I said, I could see either way with the illegal immigrant thing. Yeah, they're here illegally, but they're fucking here, and who doesn't like good Mexican restaurants? We need more of them in places that are not Texas.
So here's my other issue, and this is something I've given a lot of thought since the first time we tried to do an episode on this, which is why I wanted to re-record this. So for those of you listening, if you missed it, this is a re-recording of us talking about this situation. There is some amount of argument, and I hadn't thought about this much before. When I initially wanted to talk about this, I was sort of bandwagoning in with the anger, and there's a lot of people talking about how we need to be careful at this moment about being Islamophobic, and I was kind of into that's bullshit. And
very much so you were.
I still actually think there is some degree of legitimacy to that being bullshit. I think the biggest worry we have right now shouldn't be whether or not we're Islamophobic. I'm not saying we should be Islamophobic. I'm saying that's not that big a concern when places are getting blown up all the time. Now, some people have pointed out the two things that have made me think about that. One, and it's towards the Islamophobic aspect, and this is also towards why I actually don't think it's that bad an idea to let refugees in. Mm-hmm. In Europe especially, up until now, when we're mostly talking about the refugees, there was a lot of talk for a while in the news, and you still hear about it if you're paying attention, about people voluntarily leaving to join ISIS, or even joining ISIS from within the U.S. Mm-hmm. For example, the Boston Marathon bombers, they grew up here, didn't they? I don't think or at the very least...
They were here for quite a while, I believe.
Yeah, and I'll provide a source on whether or not I'm wrong.
I believe that they were here for maybe part of high school or all of high school, and then college.
The point is,
if not, they were just here for college.
Yeah, they didn't just show up. So, and you're getting more situations like that. So, which I think, that's an argument for why it oddly is okay to let refugees in on one hand, because the terrorists don't just come from refugees. You can get, for one thing, some terrorists who are coming from other countries will get in with or without the refugees. If they're going to sneak in, they don't need a group of refugees to sneak in with, whether or not that makes it easier. And some of them are already here. The fact that people are joining ISIS and leaving the country to do it indicates there are people who have this interest in blowing you up already. They could be living next door to you. Don't get paranoid about your next door neighbors, but you get the point.
Get paranoid about your next door neighbors.
But you should anyway, because they're probably, their grass is greener than yours and their car is nicer.
Their dogs are shitting on your lawn right now as we speak. Go out there and just fucking key their car. Do it.
But you and your next door neighbor in their Porsches. But seriously, there's already a possibility for them to be here, which is something that was brought to my mind, especially by someone who pointed out that it was a YouTube video. I'll link to it in the comments. It's from the channel In a Nutshell, where they were talking about the refugee crisis, and they noted that if the European Union took in all of the refugees, and if all of the refugees were Muslim, it would increase Europe's percentage of Muslims, because there's all this talk now about how many Muslims are in Europe. It's from 3 to 4%. So which while not a whole percent is not insignificant, it is damn near insignificant. You're not losing your culture or your society over this. Now, you may seem like you are because you have this issue of loud vocal groups. It's loud vocal minorities.
Yeah.
You have a silent majority and you have a very vocal minority. But on the other hand, this isn't going to directly ruin your culture. There's actually not that many refugees, and there's a shit ton of people in Europe, in the US. There's a lot of us. So that's one thing. That's the one thing why I think actually we could let them in.
Also, we have places like North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, where there's all 3 people living there. Sorry, guys, but all 3 of you.
We have tons of space for refugees out there.
We have tons of space for them. If we don't want them living here, we can just put them there. Guys,
but this is the thing.
I mean, it's a joke, but seriously, we have just the space to do it.
Yeah, we clearly have a lot of space. And again, it's not actually that many people. Hey guys, this is Patrick Simmons, co-host of All Downhill, reminding you about our giveaway of a free signed copy of the novella Bill the Fly by author and All Downhill guest Nate Gutman. For information and details on how to enter, visit alternative-internet.com/alldownhill, where you can also find more episodes of the show, show notes, advertising information, and details on how to get free All Downhill stickers. Our contest to win a free copy of Bill the Fly ends on American Thanksgiving, that's November 26th, so be sure to get your entries in by then. Be sure also to follow us on Twitter @AllDownhillShow and like us on Facebook, facebook.com/AllDownhillShow. And now back to the episode. So that's all on the one hand of supporting the refugees. Now here's the other thing, and this again ties in with the fact that we already have terrorists here, and this is in the favor of the Islamophobic side. Again, I'm not trying to be Islamophobic, I'm just giving some credence where credence is due. We already have some terrorists here, and they're Muslim. Now, for one thing, not all the refugees are. I think that's worth noting, and I know the thing I've been seeing around Facebook this afternoon is Obama says we're not going to let in any Christian refugees, just Muslim ones. Now, I haven't read anything on that because I'm assuming that is some kind of misinterpreted BS. If it's not, wow, that's messed up, but I'm assuming it is.
I assume it has to be false, because they're just assuming that because they're from Syria, there are no Christians there.
To the Islamophobic side's defense, this is at least ISIS is a uniquely Muslim problem. Now, I'm going to straight up throw out, because there are people who will point out, well, what if it's the CIA in Israel making ISIS? First of all, I don't really believe that. I don't actually know for sure. I'm sure the CIA has had some hand in them rising to power. They seem to be involved with that kind of thing, usually, with weapons showing up in places where they shouldn't. But that's
every conflict ever.
And that doesn't make them not Muslims. Now, there are Muslims who will say ISIS aren't real Muslims, and ISIS, and this is something worth bringing up, there's this concept of the gray zone ISIS likes to talk about, and we'll have a source for this. ISIS talks on a supposedly ISIS-run website about this gray zone, and how when events like this happen, like what they call the glorious operations of 9/11, people tend to side with either the Crusaders, which is
the West, quote unquote.
They talk about Bush specifically a lot, but the West in general. Or they'll side with the true Muslims, like ISIS. So basically they're saying it's the gray zone Muslims will pick a side and they'll either become apostate heretics and join the Crusaders, or they will join the true Muslims, which is another people, then people pull this back and they'll go, that's why we can't hate Muslims, because we can't let Islamophobia develop, because that's what ISIS wants.
See, here's the thing, though, that you have these two radically different camps of Muslims, and they're each saying that the other camp isn't a Muslim, when clearly they're all Muslim. Just doctrinally, when you look at the fundamentals of what they believe and the book that they're using, and I guess you could say that about Christians, Catholics, Baptists, everything.
To be fair there, that's something that already happens among Christians. There are Protestant sects or Reformationists, or whatever they like to be called, who will say Catholics aren't Christians. Or, you get ones like the Mormons, I think, would generally say basically no other Christians are Christians, and lots of other Christian groups usually say Mormons aren't real Christians.
Yeah.
So, you actually have this exact same fight in other groups. The difference is there's a significantly smaller amount. I'm leaving out England and France during a certain period here, but it was a fairly uniquely England/French/colonial America situation. It wasn't as much of a worldwide thing where you saw different camps killing each other quite this much. And usually if you did, it was government mandated and done with things like guillotines. There was a whole lot less of like running into each other's houses and stabbing each other.
Yeah, generally. But I mean, like the whole point to that is like, and there are like, you know, sects within the whole Muslim community. I mean, you got the Shias, the Sunnis, the Alawites, and everything like that. And that seems to be where the main divide is. But, and I've spent a little bit of time kind of researching the difference between them. There is a fair amount of difference. It's kind of like, it all kind of boils down to essentially, like the whole argument with Protestants versus Catholics, just to put it in a more Western-oriented context of, is Mary, should she be revered as she is?
Right.
Or is she just, you know, is she worshipped by the Catholics? Oh no, she shouldn't be. She should be respected.
Or is like, is the Eucharistic service, is that actually Christ's body and blood, or is it symbolic?
Yeah, it's like those sort of like high meta level differences generally is what you see.
Generally.
And like I said, I'm not a Muslim scholar, but I have spent a little bit of time researching these things, and it kind of seems, just for in my understanding of how Protestants versus, you know, generally, most Protestants and Catholicism work, that it's kind of the same divide that you have there, but there's still the same practice. It's kind of a bizarre thing where it's more specific than that.
Right.
You have Muslims who, they practice the exact same way almost, generally.
Well, you're not likely to see
not going to see
Muslim
the big
from any camp not doing their prayers at certain times of the day, observing, what's the long, is it
Ramadan.
Ramadan, or praying towards Mecca. You're going to see that kind of a thing among all of them. There are practical similarities.
Yeah, more so than I think in the varied Christian sects. You do have a lot of similarities, and I think we may be generalizing too much.
We're generalizing a little bit. You kind of have to put it into a context. But the big issue here is
But there's a lot of parallels between.
There are a lot of
those.
parallels, but you do get specific sects who tend towards their major doctrinal difference being basically whether or not you should hate people who aren't Muslim. Even beyond that, whether or not you should be killing. I mean, that's a legitimate thing some of them think. I shouldn't say not Muslim, heretics specifically, because usually it's honestly, and this is a big thing that's brought up for people who say, remember, don't think the Muslims are just out to get you. Muslims regularly kill other Muslims for not being the right sect. That's a regular,
and in fact, Muslims kill more Muslims than anything else, really. Generally.
Yeah, it's a sincere issue, which on one hand, again, that pushes the whole idea of, do you be Islamophobic? No, but there's nothing wrong with, you do be factual, accurate. You have to look at the whole picture and you have to go, no, this isn't a problem with all Muslims, but this is a large problem among Muslims. Even if it's not among a large number, it's a large problem. It happens to a large degree, maybe not a large percent. A small percent of a large group is still big.
Yeah, and I'm not going to sit here and say that, you know, Catholicism and Protestantism didn't, like, they fought over, you know, all these things for years and years and years. And eventually we decided that it wasn't worth it and we're not going to kill each other most of the time anymore.
Yeah, you don't see wars to the degree you did. And even when you did, they were very...
Like the War of the Roses.
Yes.
The 100 Years' War.
A lot of those, and this is an interesting thing to consider, is that a lot of those had other motivations. A good example would be the Spanish Inquisition, which is generally, you know, pointed
They just wanted oil.
The Catholics went through and they just wanted to get rid of all the Jews and fake witches and stuff. But if you look at like the real origins of the Spanish Inquisition, a significant amount of it was basically various cardinals and bishops who had entered to positions of political power, or, you know, they'd become friends with dukes and so on and so forth. And that led to a lot of, and lords and whatever, that led to a lot of, well, if we use the church for it, it looks like we're being holy warriors, but this is a very convenient way to kill all of my political enemies.
Alexander Dumas's Cardinal Richelieu.
Exactly.
From the Three Musketeers. He's probably the best example.
And it's not that I'm sure that happens with violence amidst Muslims, because you can't really have, at no point are you going to see any kind of large-scale violence where someone somewhere doesn't go, how can I benefit from this?
See, I think there's a fundamental difference here, necessarily. And I think it's, at this point, cultural. And again, Christians had their problems long time ago. But there is now, especially, and people will argue and say, oh, it's not anymore because the government still favors religion. We have this idea of separating church and state. There's nothing like that or has ever been that in Muslim countries.
That is for the most part true, yes.
I mean, there are a few that are more secular.
Yeah,
but for the same, but
generally,
at the same token,
you hear about it as a Muslim, an Islamic government. You hear about an Islamic government usually.
Yeah, and even Assad, he was an Alawite. I'm
saying that I'm sure there are political ones. I'm giving the benefit of the doubt there. It is mostly a religious conflict, but a large portion of that comes from, and this is also where it differs heavily from the Christian ones, is even in the Christian ones when you saw it of any sort, the best example is probably the bloodier years of the Reformation when a lot of people are getting their heads cut off. The justifications behind it are usually based on some kind of authority figure. Whereas for the Islamic issues, the justifications are usually some kind of reading of the Quran or other holy text.
Yeah.
It's usually the Quran says we need to execute apostates. And also a lot of it comes down to how you read the Quran, which leads to, and this is sort of the last major, I guess, component I want to bring up that I have a source for. And it's an article by, I'm going to try to get his name right, whatever. I say as if he's listening, but Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who is a New York Times bestselling author of the book The Black Swan. He wrote an article which has appeared in Politico. I think it was initially a Facebook post, actually, that's become a Politico article. It's very short. It's worth reading. And it's called The Saudi Wahhabis Are the Real Foe. And his point is, the way he puts it, instead of invading Iraq, blowing up Jihad John and individual terrorists, and thus causing a multiplication of these agents that would have been easier for us to focus on the source of all problems, the Wahhabi and Salafi education and the promotion of intolerance by which a Shiite or Yazidi or a Christian are a deviant people. He says it's this specific group of basically preachers and teachers, the Saudi Wahhabis, from Saudi Arabia, our ally. He says it's this particular sect of teachers that teaches this kind of everyone but us, be it other sects of Muslims or non-Muslims, are these deviants who need to be destroyed, that it's actually their teaching that indoctrinates people to the point where they'll join ISIS, which I think if you look at it in terms of ISIS's own gray zone speech.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you might go through this kind of speeches and come out still not actually going to join ISIS. But then when the moments like the bombings and things happen, and when hatred turns on the Muslims, and thus you are pushed, as ISIS likes to say, out of the gray zone
one way or the other.
Shrinks.
Yeah.
I think if you've had that kind of indoctrination, if you really have some kind of indoctrination that leads you to already mistrust people in some way, which direction you're going to get pushed? Probably more likely towards ISIS. So I think both Talib and, oddly, ISIS indicate the root of the problem, which is a specific kind of indoctrination that may push some people all the way there already, but furthermore prepares people to be pushed the rest of the way there if we don't delicately handle some of these situations.
And it's actually, one of the biggest points in the article about the gray zone, well, not really the article, is more of a, I don't know what you would call it.
A diatribe?
A diatribe, or even like I guess you'd even call it a diatribe and how-to sort of thing.
Yeah.
The most relevant quote was actually not from ISIS or the Prophet Muhammad or anything like that. It was actually from President Bush. If you're not with us, you're against us. And that's what ISIS has taken to heart. They've kind of reflected that in the bits where they talk about Muhammad wasn't a uniter, he was a divider. He was meant to divide those who are true to Allah and Islam and those who are not. Right. And that's what they believe, and that's what they say themselves. And whether or not it's a truly a real form of, and I'm air quoting here, a real form of Islam, like, other people, like other Muslims claim that it's not, they're still using the same sacred text. They're still using the same thing. Sure. And they're still saying, look, this is what we're doing, and this is how we're going to do it. And honestly, they've been wildly successful with it.
Well, and I think part of why,
which is why we really need to accept at least more refugees with open arms,
right? And when people
to a certain extent,
when people say the responsibility falls on us that we have somehow caused this, we haven't. I don't think that's fair, and I think the people who are saying that are in fact stupid. What I think
we had a hand in it.
The accurate
certainly
way to put it is we exacerbated it.
Yes.
When things happen, we exacerbate them. And I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, the liberals are right, the conservatives with their Islamophobia just give ISIS what they want. Because actually, the liberals with the calling out every time a tragedy like Paris happens within a couple minutes how we better not, get on the Muslims for this. This isn't the Muslims. And with the constant avoidance of even using the term Islamic terrorists because we might offend somebody is actually just as much of a problem, because we need to realize that not only ISIS is right about this gray zone concept, but everyone in some aspect of their lives is going to be in some kind of a gray zone. And the thing to realize about the gray zone concept isn't, we need to keep them in the gray zone. We shouldn't be placating. We shouldn't be keeping people in the gray zone, but we also shouldn't be alienating
way to be
people.
A placist.
We shouldn't be alienating people who we could bring to our side. When a major tragedy happens, you don't scream, the Muslims did it. What you do is you hunt down those Muslims, and there's huge numbers of them, who immediately start denouncing ISIS, and you bring those ones in with open arms. You hook up with those. Those are the guys who you need helping. You bring the refugees in. And this has happened in places like Syria, where you look at areas where you'll have these marginalized Middle Eastern Christian groups that have gotten along well with usually marginalized Muslim groups.
Yeah.
You look at those and you go, this can be done. All disagreements can be set aside. There are ways people can get along. Now, there are some people who you will never be able to get along with. ISIS is one of them.
Yeah.
But if we want to win the war against them, I'm not saying there's no force necessary. I don't think actually we should have boots on the ground, though that's a different discussion, because we tend to, again, exacerbate situations in a huge way. But for the people coming to us, and for the part of the war we have to really fight the most, it's ideological. And both sides, liberals and conservatives, tend to just go to extremes. The conservatives start screaming about the liberals start screaming about how we need to blame the conservatives for being too harsh on Islamists. The conservatives start screaming about how it's all the Muslims' fault and we need to blame the liberals for pandering too much. And we're actually doing the same thing ISIS wants to do, which is divide everyone, except we're dividing ourselves when we need to be not only unifying ourselves with each other, but unifying ourselves with the people in the gray zone who could be coming out of it in our direction. Even more so by doing that, by offering that hand, we're keeping people from leaving the gray zone in ISIS's direction.
That said, though, to the point about the Wahhabis, though, I don't believe for a minute that they are exacerbating the situation and making it worse, because wasabis are delicious.
As soon as you said, to your point about the Wahhabis, I thought you're going to make a joke about how that sounds like a food, because I keep thinking it does.
I was going to make that joke earlier, but
this has been All Downhill.
You've been listening to All Downhill. For more information about the topics discussed in this episode, including sources and show notes, as well as more episodes of All Downhill, visit alternative-internet.com/All Downhill. For advertising information, email Patrick Simmons, patrick@alternative-internet.com. The music used in this episode was I Have Often Told You Stories by Ivan Chu, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Thank you for listening.